Hello everybody once again, and today we continue our journey into Sony's original investment in those weirdo frat boys down at Naughty Dog, who showed them a demo reel of Crash Bandicoot doing silly things for a minute or so, and now a full game of Crash doing those same silly things for a nice round 4 or 5 hours, which will lead us nicely into the sequel, which is essentially the same game with a little nicer on the graphics, but we'll get to that in a sec. Hopefully this capital down payment you threw on the table, Sony, doesn't turn out to be a fire in waiting, but then again, Naughty Dog is still a fan favorite, so maybe I shouldn't be so needlessly sarcastic in the opening spiel, now that we have the ever-helpful hindsight of history. Cortex strikes back. Don't laugh at that title too much, since Crash Bandicoot is still trying to fly the flag of the old 90s Saturday morning cartoons that used to inhabit networks like Kids WB back before we found ourselves in Darkest Timeline 2019, where we seriously have to convince people that loot boxes are not actually a step forward for the industry because of a bunch of internet reasons I really don't want to get into. No, this is 1996 or 97, where we can still have nice games about Crash using baby bears to run away from death and destruction, along with surfboard tricks, because this is a new day and a new time for Crash. Well, not that new, considering we're still stuck with the goddamn D-pad. Well, now that I've written that on the script and wrote a big note on the side saying that's staying in, I have no idea where I was actually going with that line, but I think I was going to talk about Naughty Dog, what they've actually added in this sequel. The meaning of this is that Crash is predictably going into Mario territory with its sequels, and rather than trying to test out new skills on the fly like a one-man vaudeville show that ends in self-impalement, it's going to be your typical sequel where it's the same game again with some nominally new ideas added to the mix, like a perfected pizza recipe. The major new thing that I predicted was going to happen in the original video was that Crash Bandicoot proved that it can work, so Cortex Strikes Back is where Naughty Dog got busy at the drawing table and actually put in some story connections for their new game. Some bizarre connections that, when put all together, could end up with the entire narrative imploding on itself, but we'll come to that bridge, well, right now, since it's in the intro. In the start of the game, we figure out what happened to Cortex immediately after we thought that he had died with the whole 100, 200, 300 foot drop onto a beach thing, where he woke up in an underground portion of the island, very much alive and having discovered the very first of the franchise's goddamned crystals. Yep, we're going to be seeing these pink glowing bastards quite a bit in the future, but for now, Cortex decides to take a gap year after that embarrassing defeat and decides to craft a combination space research lab and giant fuck-off laser gun in orbit around Planet Crash that's powered using 18 or 20 other crystals that he surprisingly doesn't have. While all of this is going on, Coco finally gets added into the mix, entering the space that was left behind when Crash's love interest or older sister or love pillow, basically that lady from the end of the original, was thrown out a window. Coco is going to be a regular showing for the rest of the series, being that typical stereotype of the female nerd who manages to accomplish everything using the power of story convenience. The game opens with her telling Crash to go find a battery back at their house because she needs it for a jolly good reason, I'm sure. That level serves as the intro to tell people who haven't played in a year or so how to do it again, and also to teach the new people who decide to start with this game because numbers are for suckers, Granddad. Of course you start with the second entry in the series. Once that tutorial is completed, Cortex zaps Crash with a teleportation device that sends him to a teleportation room, whereupon he instructs Crash to go collect the crystals he needs. Now, here's where I want to stop for a few reasons. Look, I know that cartoon logic is a thing, and like I said before, Crash 2 is trying to be on the level of a Saturday cartoon. but that's not really what the excuse is supposed to be here. Cartoon logic is the suspension of disbelief thing that means that the audience should at the start be forgiving of a story involving talking dinosaurs, intelligent toddlers, or animated toys or breakfast foods living in their own little worlds, which in of itself is fine as long as it maintains one crucial thing. It remains consistent. You can have the talking babies as long as the rules make sense, and that's where the start of the game falls apart. It's not consistent at all, and it's really strange because Cortex doesn't give a reason to force Crash to do any of the things that he wants, and Crash also has no reason to do it either because he knows who Cortex is. He's that scientist guy that tried to kill Crash for stopping his plan of corrupting his entire homeland. So there is no reason at the start for why the game is taking place. It's such a weird absence because it's such an easy fix. Threaten Crash with something. Crash has no perception of the outside world when he's trapped in a teleporter. So Cortex could make up any fake scenario to force Crash to find his crystals. And again, it's even more baffling because the game does do that. In follow-up cutscenes, he reveals the threats to his sister and or the island in order to force him to do his bidding in the first place. So why didn't he start with that and have the plot make sense? Because without that, logically Crash should have sat on his ass for a couple of hours, hoping someone would rescue him, rather than gathering crystals for someone he doesn't trust for a reason that's not explained. But while I wanted to emphasize that because I thought it was funny that they forgot to write something so completely obvious, I also want to say that the inclusion of the narrative is goddamn fantastic. It's the perfect combination of weird old-timey 3D visuals, the grand voice acting, and comedically enhanced lines that truly make Crash cutscenes what they're supposed to be, and their consistent appearance in this game kept me completely invested in seeing more of Cortex and Coco, while also continuing to play the game, which is relatively short and snacky compared to what we have now, so it is technically possible to play the entire thing in one sitting, while in a haze of pixelated environments and being angry at bears, but that's not really for everybody. Thankfully, using some voodoo magic, Naughty Dog and its various successors in the franchise would be able to retain these weirdo voice actors for pretty much every game that followed this. And so I'll be able to enjoy the larks of Cortex and his various goons for years to come. And while it's nice to have a story that connects all this cartoon logic together, since we're in video game land, what truly is going to make or break the sequel is whether or not the gameplay still holds up, and of course it does. Naughty Dog agreed to a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal, and this is still the early mainstream days of this company, and thankfully the dude bros behind this malarkey weren't stupid enough to think that they could stop giving a shit this early. The good thing is that it is basically the first game again. It's the same innovative combination of 2D and 3D platforming, running in forwards and backwards. The chase sections are in there, the 2D puzzly bits are there, and it all looks freaking great. It's got some more level types, such as ice levels, more factories and temples, some sewer-typey places, and then a brief stint into space. It's definitely embracing more of that cartoony nonsense, which means that this game could be taken literally anywhere, as long as it has the same person enemy copy-pasted for every single human enemy in the game. I find it hilarious that this company does this whole thing, that this one scientist guy being constantly recycled and put in silly hats in most of these games because he is such a weird looking sprite, and putting him in a bunch of costumes just makes me snicker every time I see him. Why is Cortex cloning this guy over and over again when he's so bad at everything, except using welding torches? The important thing is that Crash is obviously adding some stuff. I didn't just make up that whole 90s cool surfboard dude thing at the start for a joke. That definitely happens and is actually pretty fun. That's not ready to be transferred to starring in an entire level on its own, but at least Naughty Dog put giant booster engines on the surfboard, so it's totally radical, my dudes. They also have monkey bar sections, some more technical vehicle sections, and the new tradition of every level having a strangely hard bonus section where you can earn tons of berries and extra lives as long as you do the entire thing really precisely. And it also introduces that infuriating 100% completion bonus so that those completionists can torture themselves with that. So at the very least, Naughty Dog continues to show that they have ideas to put in and can maintain Crash Bandicoot's traditional silliness and tight platforming while adding in these bells and whistles, which is a positive showing on where this series is going to be heading. The fleshing out of the boss fights was nice to see. There are more ridiculous, over-the-top villains that have these strange arenas and fighting styles. As much as I like that tribal leader boss fight at the start of the original, I much rather prefer fighting the sword-wielding iguanas, if you catch my drift. The whole game is an exercise in taking the idea that works so well and simply sinking more energy into it and gaining a bigger audience through the same product and more production value. Cortex Strikes Back also shows the series tradition that's going to continue of a lot of the games having hubs in the game to select levels, which makes it easy to see how much of the game you actually get to play, where you have to finish your 100% completion tasks, and gives you an easy menu to save and see your status. It doesn't allow for a lot of world building, and it doesn't do a lot of interesting things that other games have managed with more traditional world maps, but it's also not really hurting anything, and at least it's being efficient. I figured that change would just be worth mentioning. The platforming itself is really varied, giving you new mechanics, puzzles, and challenges all the time, and playing through it really does feel like the experience is incredibly fresh. And while in typical fashion you aren't going to really remember any of these levels individually, the gameplay cycle that they generate is actually pretty fun and gives you that fast-paced action from the original with the needed tweaks that come with a series that's gaining this experience. While it still suffers from the D-pad conundrum, the mechanical changes to the game help a lot to compensate for this loss in precision and make it more user-friendly and enjoyable to come back to. Seriously, if you are tired of these cynically money-grabbing games of today that's coming out of the big players, I suggest going back to the Crash trilogy back when it was still pixelated and blocky, because at least you're not playing a game that treats you like an idiot and has some actual passion behind it. To end this video, I do want to say that both the investments of Naughty Dog's developers and Sony themselves back in the mid to late 90s is nice to see, and it really shows how everyone involved believed in this series and gave creative control to the right people to make the game that they wanted to make. It's silly, it's difficult at times, and it has an attitude all its own, and in spite of all of my sarcasm at the start of this video, Cortex Strikes Back is legitimately a great sequel, with everything that was added in between the two games only serving to make the idea of the original even stronger and more of a good time for everybody playing it. If you haven't already, this game will provide a solid 4-ish hours of pure platforming fun with a good joke or two in the mix, so remember to get on playing it yourself if you haven't already. I'll solidify my opinion here with that final scoreboard. And wish you all out there a victory for gamers. Thanks for checking in on our check-in of Crash's golden years.